So, in earlier module we have discussed about the need assessment, and in the need assessment we have talked about the organizational analysis, person analysis and the task analysis, and on basis of that we have reached to a conclusion, that is, yes, before we go for the training we should be very careful in identifying the need assessments, and we should justify that there is a need for a particular training, maybe as per the requirement of the organization, maybe as per requirement of the employees, or for a particular task or position. Now, here I have taken the job evaluation as the first part of the methods of the need assessment. In the methods of the need assessment, as we were talking about the task analysis in the earlier module. So, the task analysis, that when the number of tasks they are converted into a job. So, when we go for a particular job, then the job analysis becomes very important. Job analysis that requires, that is maybe through the questionnaire, maybe through the observations, maybe through the any written document, on the basis of any particular document is there. So, how that the job will be analyzed. The analysis of job will tell us, that is, what is the nature of the job, whether it is a technical job or it is a non-technical job, or it is the skilled job or a semi-skilled job, or it is an unskilled job, or it is a different layers of the managements are there. So, that job analysis will be given. When we complete the job analysis, then job analysis will give us the job description that will describe the job. So, what is the job description? Job description is, that is the what type of the knowledge, skill, attitude is required to perform this particular job. We can take the example of the different advertisements. So, whenever there is an advertisement for a particular job, then that job talks about, that is this much years of the experience in a particular nature of job. Then the person should be having the knowledge of these particular skills. He should be able to take work from the other employees, leadership position job is there. So, in that case you will find that is the job description describes the job, and the job description is based on the analysis of the job. And when job description and job analysis are ready, then in the job analysis we also talk about job specification. Specification means the qualifications required for a particular job, and then if the particular job is the specifications the jobs are required, then it will be complete, will be process of the job analysis. Once we know the job analysis, then we can evaluate the job, and that is a job evaluation. What I have tried to compile this job analysis, job description, job specification and job evaluation as a method of the training need assessment. What is job evaluation? It is a means of determining the relative importance of job in an organization. So, like if we go for the manufacturing industry, the production, that becomes very important job. If we go for the hotel industries, the chef job becomes very important the job. When we go for the FMCG companies, then we find that is the marketing jobs, that becomes very marketing and sales job, they are becoming very important. When we go for the hospital industries, then we find the doctor's job, that is becoming a very important job is there. So, this is called the relative importance of the training. Now, in that case, it is the, if the relative importance is very high of this particular job, right, then that job evaluation will carry the very high weightage. Now, that is about the organization structure that is how it has been structured, what position it has been structured. Whenever we talk about the organization structure, then organization structure, what is the level of that particular structure, that is if we go by the different levels are there, and then in this organization structure where it has to go, that has to be seen. So, if the relevance is very important, accordingly the relevance of these particular jobs, they will be important in a structured way and orderly and consistent manner, which takes accounts of the job content and organizational context. Now, this particular job will have a particular content. So, therefore, it becomes very important, that is the whenever we talk about these particular different job positions, then these job positions that has to be taken care, that is the how these particular jobs that are important in a structured way and in the relevant manner is there. Now, it is not only in the context of the structure, organization structure, but it is also important in the context of the organization. For as I mentioned, whether the production or it is a service industry or it is a hotel industry or it is a pharmaceutical industry, the scientist jobs, they are becoming very, very important. Now, job evaluation is one of the inputs into decisions on people, other two being the person and the market. Now, here you will see the job, and in the job you will find, that is whenever we talk about the job, whatever the job is there and how it is related with the market and how it is related with the person, that becomes the very, very important. So, the person and the market, these with the nature of the job. So, this particular connect, that will create the job evaluation process in a very strong way. Job evaluation provides rank, order or roles, that is on the basis of the job, on the basis of the market, on the basis of the person, and that will rank the order or roles of a particular job. How it ranks in orders, that we will see. The relative worth of a job and determine what a fair wage for such a job should be. It is very interesting. That is, when you are organizing or designing a training program for the which nature of jobs and what is the job is there and what is the fair wage for that particular job, that becomes very, very important. So, whenever we talk about very highly paid jobs and the trainings are to be provided, then it becomes very. I would like to mention one example. Example is very simple from the Shriram group. When I was working in the Shriram group, and there was it was agrotech industries, and then Shriram agrotech industries, and there it was the boiler attendants, the first class boiler attendants. So, they are very, very important for the organization, and therefore, in that case, if we require a particular nature of job, then amongst the workers this is a highly technical and skilled job is there, and then accordingly the fair wages are to be paid for such a job should be there should be a very fair wages are to be there. Now, the other workers who are working in that particular factory, then that becomes very important, that is what type of the training is to be provided. The training is to be provided for these particular specific technical nature of job like the boiler attendant, and the training which is to be provided for the machine operators, training is to be provided for the helpers, all these points that has to be the job evaluation is to be taken into consideration. Job evaluation, it should be noted, begins with job analysis, as I mentioned, a systematic way of gathering information about a job. That is the how do you make the job analysis. Now, you see, it is very important for every organization to have a very perfect HR manual. So, each and every job, whether the job in a regular nature, job is into a temporary nature, job is into once in a year even, then this type of the jobs that are also to be taken into consideration in the job analysis. Because a person may require for very less time, a nature of job may be require very less time, but in that case that even that particular time period his role and importance becomes very important. So, in that case it becomes very important, that is a systematic way of gathering information about a job that has to be taken into consideration, and ends at that point where the worth of a job. Now, irrespective of the where the person is working in the organization and the organization structure is there, then the worth of a job that has to be taken into the consideration. So, at the middle management level, lower management level, at whatever level the person is working, but his worth that becomes very important. Many times it has been told that is the PA to the officer is more important than the officer himself. So, it just means that is the what is the worth of a job is there, and then that becomes one should be able to handle the all the jobs, all the positions in an efficient way, is ascertained for achieving pay equity between the jobs. Is all of us know that is whenever we talk about the equity pay, right. So, that is the low, medium and high, and low, medium and high, that is the nature of job and the nature of job and the pay for performance and pay relationship. So, naturally whenever we talk about the equity, so equity comes here, high performance high pay, moderate performance moderate pay, and low performance and low pay. So, therefore, in that case this particular point you will see that is the equity is to be there. It should not be underpaid and it should not be overpaid. So, this particular equity, right, in the job evaluation, so that is pay equity has to be between the jobs is to be there. Now, here when we talk about the performance and pay relationship, right, and when we talk about the equity, then what type of the training programs are to be provided. So, in the training need assessment we should know the worth of a job and level of performance of the job. When we talk about the level of performance of the job and the worth of a job, then in that case it becomes very important, that is we talk about that is the we are able to understand the training need, what training need assessment we can do. Job evaluation is different from performance appraisal, right. We have to understand this thing, that is whenever we talk about the job evaluation and the performance appraisal. So, in that case you will find that is whenever we talk about the performance appraisal. So, performance appraisal is for the individual, it is for the employee performance appraisal. So, employee will have the performance appraisal, while when we talk about the job right, so that will be job evaluation. So, this is for the employee, this is for the person, and this is for the particular job is for the job evaluation. So, job evaluation evaluate the job, performance appraisal appraise the employee, and so there is a difference between the job evaluation and the performance appraisal of the employee, because when we do the performance appraisal, in the performance appraisal we try to see that how a particular employee has performed, whether it is the satisfactory or he is not performed satisfactory, and then on basis of that we discuss about that is the how the performance appraisal of the employee is done. But when we talk about the job evaluation, irrespective of who is the person who performing this particular job, the job, what is the worth of a job is there, and that is the difference between the job evaluation and performance appraisal. Performance appraisal is a systematic description of an employee's job, that is what job he is doing, and related strengths and weaknesses. The strength and weaknesses related to the employees to do a particular job. Then we will talk about the performance appraisal when we are evaluating the strength and weaknesses of the employee. But when we are talking about the strengths and weaknesses of a particular job, then that we will talk about the job evaluation, that is how the job evaluation has been done. So, we have to be very careful whenever we talk about the job evaluation. Job evaluation is a method for the identifying the training need assessment, and in which when we evaluate the job, then we understand it is very important job. Then we have to design the training program according to the strength and weaknesses of that particular job is there. Evaluation requires job information, that is what type of the job information is there. So, that if that job information comes through the job analysis, job description and job specifications. The knowledge of the evaluator, that is the person who is evaluating that particular job, how much experience and aware and known for that particular job. A person from a cross field may not be necessarily equally good. A person with the specialization and expertise, then definitely he is supposed to be more competent that to evaluate that particular job. And for this purpose there will be the different like logbook will be there, document will be logbook, document will be the HR manual, document will be the appraisal reports, especially all these will create that particular information about that particular job. Whenever we talk about this particular context, then in that case the first and foremost in job evaluation, that is what is the company's purpose. For what purpose the particular employee is working in that particular job. So, if that job in the context of the company is how relevant and how useful is, and that will create the company's clear about the job evaluation. Then financial structure of that particular job, that is the how much the investment is there and how much is the ROI, return on investment of that particular job, how much we are paying to do that particular job, and when the job is performed, what is the return to the organization by that particular job, that will give importance. Third context for this job evaluation, that will be the structure, that is in the organization structure where is the job, and that will determine its importance, that is what is the importance of that particular job. Next is the ownership, that is does the particular job creates an ownership amongst the employees. If employees performing that particular job and they create an ownership in that, then definitely it is a highly valued job is there. But a job in which the ownership is not there, the highly weightage will not be given to that particular job. Organization, culture and sector, as I already mentioned, that is whenever we talk about the manufacturing, then in manufacturing the production jobs, they are given very much importance. While in case of the FMCGs, there will be the marketing and sales job which will be given the more importance. And then also the sector, that is which industrial sector are you. For example, there was a boom for the IT sector. So, every job in the IT sector they were highly evaluated. Then whenever we talk about the pharmaceutical sector, then in pharmaceutical sector the research is becoming very important. If we talk about the academia, then in academia also you will find that is the faculty's job, that is becoming very highly important. So, these are the certain examples which I talk about, that is the how these job evaluations can be done. The sector characteristics already I have discussed, that is the pharmaceutical, FMCGs, manufacturing, hotel industries, hospitals, academia. So, these are the sector characteristics are there, and in that context which is job becoming more important, and that already some examples I have given. Now, when we talk about the job, now the company purpose and job purpose, right, that becomes very important. When we talk about the dimensions of the job, the dimensions of the jobs are, there are many dimensions can be there. So, there can be even the semi skilled jobs. So, such type of jobs that will require the operational skills, but no qualification necessarily is required. While the very skilled job is there, the professional qualification with the operations specialization, that is required, combination of both is required. And if the highly important job is there, then the accountability will be also very high. So, in the context of the management, when we talk about the managerial positions, then the accountabilities will be the output, the results. And here is interesting to note, that is a particular job is the person who is working, that job only is not responsible for the output. There are certain relevant and connected jobs are there. So, whatever job we do, and the before and after, and the above and below, all these dimensions, that will create the value to the particular job. So, if this is the job is there, and then when we talk about the accountabilities, this particular job requires support from all the dimensions, the previous department, previous sections, and the sections to this particular job is doing, the job work is to be loaded, or the person who is the job which is to be supported by like a technical job, machinery job, which will be requiring the support facilitating job is there. So, all these dimensions that is required to be consideration in this particular context. If that is done, then in that case it will be found that is the accountability of that particular job is very high. Nature of job and the ownership, that becomes very important. If I want to connect the job with the context, then the accountability creates the ownership of that particular person. So, when we are making the job evaluation, so we have to also a trainer, what a trainer has to see from this particular slide, a trainer has to see that is the accountabilities, what type of the accountabilities this particular job is carrying, authority and responsibilities, what is the job this particular job is carrying, and if the authority and responsibilities is very high, so then it is carrying the ownership. So, there is a direct relationship between the ownership and accountabilities. Higher the fulfillment of the accountabilities, higher is the ownership. Lower the fulfillment of the accountabilities, lower is the sense of ownership is there, and therefore, in that case it becomes very important, that is we are making the relationship between the accountabilities and the ownership is there. Next is about the skills, knowledge and experience that is required for a particular job. This particular job will be requiring, that is what type of the skills, knowledge and experience is required. If the skills, they are highly specific, they require a high degree level, then definitely in that case that particular job will be carrying the very high level of the evaluation. Now, when we talk about the knowledge level, earlier module I have mentioned knowledge level 1, knowledge level 2, knowledge level 3, knowledge level 4 and knowledge level 5. If there are the 5 levels of the knowledge, then in that case it becomes very important, that is that particular job is a highly evaluated job. Experience, more experience is required, there is a leadership positions, higher the experience, then that will create the more weightage into the job evaluation, that is yes, this particular job requires at least this much years of experience, and therefore it is becoming more accountable, then it is having the more responsibility and authority. There are certain challenges are associated with the each and every job. So, each and every job is required to be associated with the particular challenges, and these challenges will be rather it can come from the environment, and if the environmental challenges are there because of the any social reasons or legal reasons or technical reasons, then in that case the particular job which has to handle the more challenges, and the level of challenges is very high, level of challenges is uncertain, level of challenges are unpredictable, and then the job has to have to handle those type of the main challenges, then definitely in the job evaluation that particular job will be having the high weightage. Now, we will talk about the process of job evaluation. the process of job evaluation talks about, that is gaining acceptance from the employees and the trade unions. That becomes very, very important. That is what sort of the particular job is the accepted by the employees by themselves, and how the trade unions, they are making the acceptance of this particular job. If the job is accepted by the employees, job is recognized, then definitely we can have a creating a job evaluation committee. The job evaluation committee's job is, that is to classify that particular job into the where it is to be placed. On basis of the finding, the jobs to be evaluated, right. So, therefore, when the committee will talk about, that is these knowledge, skill, as we talk about in this particular previous slide, that is the knowledge, skills, experience, accountability, this is becoming very important. That is whenever we talk about the accountability, the knowledge, skills and experience, then and main challenges also is related to that particular job, then in that case it becomes very, very important, that is the how the job is to be evaluated. Now, on basis of this, analyzing and preparing the job descriptions, that is the job as I mentioned in the beginning, that is job analysis and job description. So, here it will be the preparing the job descriptions will be there. So, that job descriptions are to be taken into the considerations. These job descriptions will be giving the selecting the method of job evaluation. So, whatever the job description comes, on basis of the job descriptions we will decide about the job evaluation processes, that is which method, which I will be talking about further, that is which method is to be used for the job evaluation. On methods of the job evaluation, we will classifying the jobs, that is the whether it is a high level job, or it is the skilled job, or it is semi skilled job, unskilled job, engineering job, professional job, management engineering professional job, or the managerial professional jobs. That classifying the jobs we will talk about. Then installing the program, and on basis of this the program will be installed and reviewing the process periodically, and then accordingly the job evaluation process will be done. Now, here I would like to take an example of job evaluation from the Ballarpur Industries. This example presents that how Ballarpur Industries compare the merits and significance of one of the job vis-a-vis another is there. Now you see, that is the n number of jobs are there. Every job is having the highly important task which is to be performed, at whatever level is the job is there, whether it is even the unskilled level of job is there, but every job is very highly important job for the overall organization, because it is linked to the another job. In these industries, what they have done, the chart profile method of the job evaluation has become of the utmost importance in view of the flattening organizations. Now you see, always it has been found, that is the whenever we talk about the organization structure, the every position, that is job, the job and position, that has to be assigned with a certain authority, and the responsibilities are there. So, it has to be with the utmost importance in view of the flattening of the organizations. So, this flattening of the organization, right, that has to be related with the authorities and responsibilities. If authorities and responsibilities are to be provided with this particular job, then definitely in that case long term career planning. Now you see, that is the some people, they are interested only in the jobs, some people are interested into the career. So, how it makes a difference between a job and the career is there. Job is, that is the whatever the person is doing, he is not much inclined towards the growth, he is feeling the contented, he is satisfied. Many times there can be the examples of plateau in the organization. This type of the plateau in the organizations, they are not taking interest further, and then whatever the job they are doing, they say okay, enough, this much I am getting and this is enough for my life, and then they are not further interested in building their career. But when we talk about this particular job evaluation process, and especially in these industries, they have talked about the long term career planning are to be made. Even in current situation, whenever the HR department has to plan, keeping in mind though, that is the employees turnover, is in the young generation, in this Gen generation is very high, and the sticking to the one organization may not be very long as compared to earlier, in the earlier days where the employees were working for the long period of time. Now, so therefore, this long term career planning many times attract for a certain class of the people, those who want to continue because of their personal reasons in that organization. If this is the situation, then in that case the career planning is to be made, and in this career planning of the individuals, that will help to create the long term career planning, and organizations are there. There will be the rationalization of the reward system. Now, you see that is the industries are trying, like this in this particular example of the Ballarpur industries, what they have done. They have identified certain jobs, and in the certain jobs there is a requirement of the long term career planning, because they have found that is a certain employees, a certain jobs, the people those who are working in a particular jobs and they are not leaving the organization, like the other some of the young people or the new generation's style, rather than they are sticking to the jobs, and there is a long term career planning is required, and as a result of which, if the person is continuing for the long term, then definitely a reward system that has to be followed, and if the reward system is there, then in that case the retention of the employees, better performance at the current job, that the chances of the better performance that becomes very higher level. The VP HR pointed out here that is, if of this particular Ballarpur industries, if you want to understand which job stands where in a hierarchy, job evaluation is the only objective way of doing so. So therefore, in that case it is very important statement, that is the, if you want to understand which job stands where in a hierarchy, so therefore it is very important the authorities, the responsibility, ownership of that particular job, how much relevant and important to that particular organization. So job evaluation is the only key, right, which is the way of doing so you will understand where this particular job stands. The company uses chart method of the Hay job evaluation developed by the Hay Group consultancy firm, and in this particular organization what they have done, they have developed a particular chart, and in this chart they have classified on the basis of these the sometimes of the ranking of the job, that is which job is stands and where in a hierarchy, and on basis of their ranking and putting them in the nature of importance, and accordingly there will be the reward systems are provided. This Ballarpur industries, it has more than 1300 management jobs are there. If so many jobs are there in a particular jobs, then definitely in that case it becomes important, that is the how you are classifying their jobs, how you are making the reward system for the each and every job, how you are creating the knowledge, skill and ownership that for that particular job, and that is only possible with the help of job evaluation. So how it helps in the training needs assessment, when we are able to classify here the nature of jobs, when we are able to understand the job where the job stands, when we know the knowledge, skill and attitude required, when we know about the ownership required to do this particular job, without any ownership this job cannot be successful. So in this, all these, while delivering these particular attributes, that is a knowledge, that is about the skill, that is about the transformation of the functions of that particular job, or creating the ownership of the job, and then if there are certain problems. So that need assessment, what does need assessments first outline that what is expected. So these are the expectations of performance. On basis of the job evaluation, we talk about to do this particular job, these are the parameters, knowledge, skills, different dimensions of the job are to be performed, and there are challenges in the jobs which are to be faced time to time, then your ownership is to be, in the context of ownership, is to be created, and if this is the method which is to be found, then definitely in that case, that is the we can make the where is the gap against these benchmarking parameters. If these benchmarking parameters are performed, then definitely we can make the evaluation of the job, and accordingly wherever there is a gap by performance of these particular jobs, then we can create the training programs on basis of this. The job evaluation has enabled it to eliminate at least such 200 excess jobs, right. Now you see, it is just like a GE example of the GE also. In GE also, what has been done, that is the number of jobs have been eliminated, not the persons, but the jobs have been eliminated, because it has been found with the help of technology or by adopting the different methods, there are the number of jobs which are not required. So, there is no importance of this particular job, and when there is no importance of particular jobs, there is no need for providing the training for these particular jobs. So, job evaluation has enabled it to eliminate at least certain 200 such excess jobs in these Ballarpur industries, and hundreds of jobs into the GE Capital, GE Electrical, and then in that case you will find that is it has created, that is the no training is required for these particular jobs. Based on 3 factors, that is know-how, problem solving and accountability, it was possible to estimate complexity of job. So, therefore, that is how this job is to be done, that is the know-how of the job, the problem solving of this particular job, that is the how these problems are to be solved, and what is important in solving this particular problem, and the accountability of that particular job, that is the whether the person is how much he is accountable, and if the person's accountability is very high, then in that case it has to be found, that is the where the job is standing, and if the accountabilities are to be matched, problem solving approach has to be done, then different training techniques are to be used. So, for example, the problem solving, the case study methods will be helping, that is how the problems are to be solved. In case of the accountability can be managed in the case with the help of the business games. That is, if one is failing into the accountability, then in that case it requires, that is the person has to develop that particular accountability is to be developed. So, it was possible to estimate the complexity of the job, and accordingly the rewards are that has to be managed. As soon as all jobs were awarded hay points, that is the particular for the problem solving know-how, that is how this job is to be done, and if the person is not able to meet this particular job, then what type of the training is to be provided, and accountability that is to be managed to estimate the complexity of the jobs. And here is making the certain points are there, and it was easy to evolve the correct hierarchical levels in the company on the basis of the accountability. So, therefore, in that case, this way the evaluation of Ballarpur Industries, they are making this particular parameters of the evaluation of the job. For example, nice example has been given here. Suppose a CEO earned 4,224 points, while the junior most management trainee obtained only 115 hay points. Looking to the accountability, responsibility, problem solving and know-how, then accordingly whether the person is able to meet these points or not. And if the particular employee is not able to meet, for example, CEO is not able to meet 4,224 points, then in that case there will be the measurement, that is where he is lacking, and wherever the areas the gap is there, and for that purpose the training can be provided. The seniority levels were accordingly designed, that similar the points, all the jobs were given certain points, and the employees were supposed to achieve these points, and whenever they are failing to achieve these particular points, and the weightage are points, and then in that case those are the training areas where the employees are to be trained. And there must be finally there must be a difference of 15% for a visible distinction between the two levels, and naturally whenever we talk about the identifying training needs, then there has to be a certain gap, minimum gap, then only we can design that particular training program, and this level has been given by this particular industries 15%, and every organization can decide, that is that if somebody is performing what percentage is allowed to meet the targets, and then if it is not meeting, then the training program can be designed and identified, that is what type of the training program can be provided. So, this is all about, that is identifying the training need on the basis of evaluating the job evaluation and training need based. Thank you.